That is a very, very interesting question, and of course, let me move into another place, which is, what if Spiro Agnew hadn't resigned before Richard Nixon was faced with the prospect of resigning? Would members of Congress have gone to the White House to force him to resign when the alternative was in some measures worse? And there's no easy answer to that question, but I think it would have created a very, very different dilemma. And in the same way, just as a thought exercise, if it turns out to be the case that Donald Trump is occupying the White House illegitimately because the thumb was put on the scales, then Mike Pence is occupying his office illegitimately. Whether he has committed impeachable offenses himself or not, is there any possibility that Republicans in the House and Senate, Republicans in the Senate especially, even if there is incontrovertible proof of this, would let Nancy Pelosi become the President of the United States? And I think the answer to that is not a chance.
Let me ask one more of my own questions, and that is, you've been studying Congress and presidency for a few decades.
Yes.
And obviously you are one of the foremost experts in the world on this. Did you ever think that there would be a time where we would actually be talking about the 25th Amendment in any context other than a theoretical exercise?
And the answer to that question is no, I didn't think that. But I have to also say, I came to Washington in the fall of 1969, worked on the Hill as a congressional fellow. I've basically been immersed in our political process, especially from that end of Pennsylvania Avenue, but more broadly, for what will soon be 50 years. And I never expected that we would have politics like we have now, or that we would have a Congress like we have now, that isn't providing any of the checks and balances that ought to be there in place. So we are, I believe, in uncharted territory. Not that we haven't had points of crisis in our politics and our culture and our history in the past. And this goes beyond politics, of course. It's a broader set of cancers in the society and in the body politic more generally. But I firmly believe we're at an existential point in our political process, and it's going to take extraordinary developments to move us beyond it. And I would also add that anybody who thinks that the problem is simply Donald Trump, and that if Donald Trump goes, we can breathe that sigh of relief, has not been following our politics for the last 30 years, or doesn't understand some of the enormous challenges that will be there and be extraordinarily divisive for us, with a tribal and sectarian conflict that is not going away but is only deepening across many, many divides, and that we have to put our minds to dealing with a lot of those larger issues. If you're not thinking of things that way, you're making a mistake. This is not simply about right now, or about the 25th Amendment right now, or whether it's an appropriate use of things, and we'll have, I'm sure, an exhaustive and really good discussion of that this afternoon. It's about a bigger and deeper set of maladies in the society.
Well, let me just follow up on that. When do you think this tribalism really took root? I mean, obviously, you go all the way back to the very beginning and look at ugly campaigns, etc. But it seems like things are different, a little bit different in the modern era.
So, Dave mentioned the most recent book. My colleague Tom Mann and I did a book in 2006 called The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. And then we did a book in 2012 called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And we followed that with a paperback edition called It's Even Worse Than It Was. And if I do another one, it will probably be Run for Your Lives. But there's a lot in those books about how we got to this point. And I, as we were talking at the table at lunch, I point to January 3rd, 1979, when Newt Gingrich got sworn in as a member of Congress. And as I was telling at the the table. I had just gone, I was teaching at Catholic University, and took a part-time position, as did my colleague Tom Mann, at the American Enterprise Institute, and we created something called the Congress Project. And the first thing I wanted to do was have a series over 2 years of off-the-record dinners with new members of Congress, 8 of them, where we could sort of trace what was happening in our politics and in the institution through their eyes. And we had quite a group to choose from, a midterm election, but we had Dick Cheney, Geraldine Ferraro, and Newt Gingrich among them. And Newt was a dominant figure in those conversations because he came in knowing what he wanted to do to break what was then a 24-year stranglehold that Democrats had on majorities in the House with no foreseeable change, to create a Republican majority. And it really was to tribalize our politics, to convince Americans, however long it took, that it was so disgusting and evil and bad in Congress and in Washington that they would rise up and say, we don't care who the incumbents are, we don't care if our person is great, throw them out, bring the outs in. And it took him 16 years, but he accomplished it. But along the way, he deliberately tribalized politics. He turned the ethics process into a way of criminalizing policy differences and making it more partisan. He made sure that he could take the Republicans in Congress who had been comfortable working with Democrats even though they were in the minority and radicalizing them. He made sure that he could get a complacent, arrogant, patronizing Democratic majority who had been corrupted by their own power to overreact. And then he had a populist uprising with a pay raise for public officials in 1988-89, and the rise of tribal media after the Fairness Doctrine was repealed that could capitalize on all of that. And that was the beginning of a process. He's not the only one. It has been accelerated in the decades since. But what's also important to remember is what started in Washington metastasized out to the states and now to the public as a whole. And now we're driven by negative partisanship. There's far more people voting because they can't let those equal people on the other side win. And while we had political polarization emerge, and we did have, when I came to Washington, the vast majority of members were somewhere near the middle of the field, and there were, of course, many, many conservative Democrats. We called them boll weevils back then, for that insect that infected cotton in the South. And we had a whole lot of moderate Republicans we called gypsy moths, for that bug that hits hardwood trees in New England and the Northeast. And they disappeared. But you can be polarized and still work together. You can view people on the other side as very good people who just have a different, if wrong-headed worldview, but we can find ways to solve problems. When it's tribal, they're the enemy and they're evil. And that has been accentuated in part because the business models of journalism changed, and because we have people who have deliberately capitalized on this for their own advantage. And frankly, as somebody who worked very closely with members across all lines, trying to improve Congress, trying to get different kinds of reforms, it's a Republican Party, as much as anything, encouraged by Gingrich, that has gone off the rails. Both parties have moved apart, but I used to say to my students, if I wanted to describe the Congress in the 70s and in the 80s, I would say, imagine if we took all the members and drove them in buses a mile and a half due east of the Capitol to what used to be our football stadium, RFK, and said to them, go down on that field and place yourselves where you would feel most comfortable, your worldview would be. And we went up into the press box, we would look down on a visual distribution of the bell curve, of a normal distribution. Most of them congregated near the midfield stripe and a lot of admixture. If we took today's Congress and redrew the lines on the defunct stadium, went to the press box and looked down, there'd be a handful of people around the midfield area. A few more now because Democrats actually elected some moderates from districts that had been Trump districts. We would have very few there, though. And then you go out and you'd see on one side of the field a fair congregation of people between the 20 and 30 yard lines, some down towards the goalpost. And on the other side of the field, a whole lot of people right around the goalpost, and then a lot more swimming in the Anacostia River. And the fact is that both the moderate Republicans and the pragmatic conservatives are gone, for the most part. They either got defeated, because those are the districts that are most in battle, or they left voluntarily. I talked to my friend Charlie Dent, who was perhaps the last of the sort of moderates in the House on the Republican side, and he just couldn't take it anymore. Because basically he didn't have a home anywhere, in his own party, much less on the other side. And now we have a party where the Freedom Caucus had been a fringe element, and now they're the core. And there's a danger when one party goes off the rails that the other is going to follow, and that's something the Democrats have to worry about now. But right now, it's a bigger problem on one side, but it's a larger problem in the culture. How do you move past a tribalism if you come to believe, as a majority of Americans do now, that they would be more uncomfortable if a child of theirs married somebody from the other party than from another religion and another race at this point? That's a very tough thing to deal with.
And that dovetails right into my next question. What do you see as a way out of today's tribalism we now have? What is the prescription, Dr. Ornstein?
The first thing to keep in mind is it's not going away anytime soon. And what we have to do as much as anything else right now is triage, which is we have to keep this from careening completely out of control. And as we've now seen with some of the steps towards autocratic forms of rule, and all of the many very good books on how democracies die, how autocracies rise. Or if you go to the Holocaust Museum and you look at the exhibit they have on the 12 signals that you're moving towards fascism, it can happen anywhere, and some of them are starting to move. You look at the former Yugoslavia or other countries where sectarian divisions can lead to something much worse. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. We have to try as best we can to create a different media environment, to change the business models so that tribal media don't have advantages. And that's a hard thing to do. I think we need to do more with public media. And we need to find ways to subsidize public media to create a different kind of discourse. I've been meeting with new members of Congress in the House, and I've pushed something that I've pushed for many years without success, which is to create real debates on the floor of the House. They don't have to be Democrats against Republicans. I want to have a couple of people on one side and a couple on the other who can have a civil, passionate discourse about what you do about the major problems facing the country. And bring back the notion that you can actually have debate and dialogue. And I want to have debate. This is something we were talking about earlier. My friend Bob Lighton, who is a longtime scholar at Brookings and a former deputy chief of the Antitrust Division, was a stutterer as a young kid, and debate changed his life, and he's writing a book about how we need to make debate and speech a requirement in schools, because when you debate, you have to learn both sides, you have to argue both sides or all sides, but you also have to do it in a civil fashion if you're going to get anywhere. And the Parkland kids in Broward County, because they were so successful at debate, made it a requirement in the schools. And those impressive kids you saw in the aftermath of that horror were so impressive in part because they'd been taking a speech class on gun control. And they knew the issues. They knew how to argue against the people who were their adversaries. And the NRA didn't know what hit them with those kids. They were not intimidated by others, but they also knew how to do it in a fashion that could perhaps persuade others. So there may be ways of dealing with this. But frankly, we're going to need to have elections. You have to have a party lose 3 elections in a row to get jolted away from the notion that, oh, we lost because we had a horrible candidate. And oh, it was just the perfect storm, the economy and all of that, into realizing you've got to get back and reach to a broader electorate if you're going to be competing for a majority. And without that, I think we've got a tough road to hoe. And I would also say the burden is on all of us everybody who is an opinion leader in this society, and that means everybody in this room, whether you're running a newspaper or writing for a newspaper, running a nonprofit or running a business, being at a major university, teaching law students, political science students, or others. This is a burden we all carry. And it's a difficult burden in part because you have to call out, there are evil people out there. There are people exploiting this in very bad ways. There are people who are cruel to the core. But calling them out also means you have to pivot and somehow deal with others who have legitimate reasons for having the viewpoint that they have, or for understanding how you can develop a different relationship with them that may still be adversarial, but not corrosive.
In a country where we've had voter suppression for a couple hundred years in our elections, what makes 2016 different in which we're seriously calling, some people are seriously calling this president illegitimate? I mean, you can look at 2000, the Florida debacle, and in that time, there was a big push for people to come together and rally around the president. What makes this period different?
So there are a few ways to answer that. One is, there's no doubt that corruption in elections, keeping people from voting, horrible rhetoric, go right back to the beginning. We've had eras of really bad corruption. We've had reforms that have followed. The Australian ballot, the secret ballot, all came from corruption caused by party machines and the like, and we've had other ways of dealing with it. It's also very frustrating to me because if you look at elections around the world, we are the only country, among other things, that has partisans running our elections. Every other country that has some semblance of democratic elections has nonpartisan professionals who run the elections. And imagine how we feel about, let's just take the NFL. If the Super Bowl referees all had part ownership in one of the teams. Now, if I were in New Orleans, I might use a different analogy. Although as a Minnesota Viking fan who felt jobbed by the New Orleans Saints 10 years ago, that's a different matter. But there are so many ways in which we are unique in the way we run our elections. And at the same time, we're the only country that puts the burden of registration for voters on the individual instead of on the state. So there are ways of dealing with this. I happen to be a passionate proponent of something that is not likely to happen in the foreseeable future, which is bringing us the Australian system of mandatory attendance at polls. In Australia, you don't have to vote. You can cast a ballot for none of the above. But if you don't show up, or you don't have an excuse that you write, then you're subject to a fine. The first fine is about $15. Before they did this, almost 8 decades ago, their attendance at the polls was pretty close to ours, 50% or so. Every election since has been 90% or more. Now, I'm not going to tell you that having 90% turnout is an automatic indicator of functionality or legitimacy. The former Soviet Union had 98%. There were times in Chicago when it was 110. But what happens when you have everybody voting is, among other things, you don't have a politics driven by consultants who are only interested in turning their base out and suppressing the other side's base. And you have to focus on persuadable voters. And it's not perfect, but it changes the way you discuss things in your politics. And it changes the incentives, because now our incentives are, why should you work with people on the other side if in doing so they'll get credit for something and they may be able to win elections? But if you have everybody voting, if you don't work with people on the other side, you're likely to turn off those persuadable voters in the middle. So there are things we need to do, but I think we can also say this. We have a political system set up by the framers, partly out of practical necessity, that gave, of course, enormous power to the states. But at a time when the ratio of population between the smallest and the largest state was about 12 to 1, moving to about 15 or 16 to 1. Now it's 70 to 1. If you look at the first election where the popular vote actually mattered and was counted in some fashion, 1824, and take it up through 1996, 44 elections, arguably one where it was clear-cut that the winner of the presidency did not win the popular vote. Since then, 2 out of 5. The Electoral College is being skewed, and I will tell you another great challenge we have. By 2040, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states. That means 30% of Americans will elect 70 senators. And that 30% are not representative of the diversity and change and economic dynamism in the country. And we're going to have challenges to legitimacy. So the first time it happens, arguably the most controversial election in our history, 36 days to decide it. Loser of the popular vote wins on a 5-4 partisan decision by the Supreme Court. But the reaction of Americans was, hey, somebody's got to decide it, and those are the rules. It's like in tennis, it's not how many games you win, it's how many sets. The second time, maybe not quite so nice. By the third time or the fourth time, which we're likely to have unless we see some changes in the system, that whole sense of whether the system is legitimate, that voters are the ones who make choices, even in a republic. And this is an argument you get often from the right. We're not a democracy, we're a republic. The way a republic is supposed to work is that voters choose the representatives who then represent the voters. What if voters choose the representatives and those voters don't represent them, or they don't actually choose their representatives, or the ones who form the majority is there in the country? And we need some serious consideration of whether changes are required now, because this is not the way I think it was intended to work.
Well, you did mention Birch Bayh, I think, a couple times, and obviously he's one of the people behind the National Popular Vote movement, which is a movement to essentially dismantle the Electoral College through state legislation. Is there a possibility that that effort could eventually be successful, or other events to reform the Electoral College?
So I've helped out with something called Make Every Vote Count, which is the National Popular Vote Compact, which is unfortunately named because a state compact is expressly forbidden in the Constitution. But there are now over 170 electoral votes who are a part of this, and that is states passing legislation saying that once enough states get over the 270 electoral vote threshold, they will direct their electors to cast votes for the winner of the national popular vote. That's not going to happen. So here's my solution. It's something I resisted for a long time for many reasons, some practical and some otherwise, and that is to enlarge the House of Representatives. I'd add 100 people to the House. Now, why? Because right now, Californians' vote, as it is counted in the Electoral College, is worth a tiny fraction of what a Wyoming voter's vote means. But if you add more members, most of them are going to go to the more populous states. And they're going to have, therefore, more clout when it comes to the Electoral College. Also, if you add, what I'd like to do is have 100 people added, and some of them will be elected at large. Now, if I had my druthers, I would also repeal the 1967 law that requires single-member districts for the House. I'm very much enamored of a system that Illinois used for decades in electing its state house, which is 3-member districts, and people could cast votes 3 for one, 2 for one and 1 for another, or 1 for each of 3. Now what happened is, first of all, larger districts became more heterogeneous, so you represented more different kinds of people. But also, if you were a candidate, there were a lot of candidates who ran, you had an incentive to move away from the edge and to try and persuade people at least to make you the second choice, or to cast 1 vote out of the 340. And when they did away with it and went back to the traditional model, single-member districts first past the post, their legislature has ended up tribalized just the way so many others have. So those are things that can be accomplished without changing the Constitution. Remember that we have a 435-member House of Representatives because of a 1910 law that just capped it. So before that, we grew from 65 as population grew. Now there's a downside to that. First, it's not clear how you accommodate them all on the Capitol grounds. Second, theoretically at least, the whole point of the House was you get people from vastly disparate areas representing different kinds of people who meet face to face, debate, deliberate, are able to put themselves in other members' shoes, and then organically reach results. The more people you have, the less you're going to have that face-to-face, although we have much less of it now. I will say one of the other things I've recommended to the new people in the House, they have a committee now that's going to look at this. I want members to go to other members' districts and spend a weekend walking around with them, and do it with people from the other party. It's very hard to understand where people are coming from unless you're there. So I was talking with a new member from New Mexico, a really attractive and intelligent young woman whose district has a 185-mile border with Mexico. And the other Democrats need to understand what it's like to have their own members, whatever their ideological viewpoint generally is, if they have this enormous expanse of a district and not, a bunch of blocks in Manhattan, and what their voters feel and think. We just get less of that now, and we certainly have none of it across the lines.
All right, let's switch gears, and my question is, if President Trump is deemed illegitimate, then would his federal judicial picks also be deemed illegitimate, and then what happens?
We can talk about this in theory. The practical reality, of course, is we're not going to undo or unravel everything that's happened over the last 2 years. What's happened has happened. When we talk about tribalism, we can't ignore the reality that the courts have become as tribalized as the political process. The selection of judges and justices, the dynamic of the confirmation process, and while I have a couple of friends on the Supreme Court, not as many as Harold, but they say whenever you talk about the divisions, because they don't want people to think of the court as being illegitimate in the decisions that it makes. 80% of what we do is unanimous or near unanimous. And my response to that is, yeah, now let's talk about, say, the 5 or 10%, like Shelby County and Citizens United, that are the ones that reverberate dramatically across the country, or the ones you made about business and labor that are 5-4, and that are entirely predictable based on the party of the president who nominated the justice. And what we know now is the vetting process, where we used to get political figures on the court. Harold, when he was dean of the Yale Law School, invited me up, actually my wife's reunion, 40th reunion. And at the alumni weekend, they had a symposium on the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education. And there were 6 clerks, the justices who had been there at the time, recounting the dynamic. It was just mesmerizing. This went on over 2 years. And what happened is those justices across the spectrum realized that a decision like Brown was going to reverberate immensely in the society, could tear us apart or not, and they wanted to take the time necessary to find a way to make it unanimous or near unanimous. 6 of those 9 justices had been in political office at one point in their lives and understood the society and the politics because they'd been out in different ways. Since Sandra Day O'Connor, the possibility of having somebody who had been in elective office has diminished very greatly, because you want to be sure you get people on the court who are going to do what you want them to do and not be unpredictable. Remember, Dwight Eisenhower said that Earl Warren, who of course presided over that particular decision, was the biggest damn fool mistake he made in his life, because he turned out to be more liberal than Eisenhower had wanted. And David Souter was the last time that you had a justice where people on the Republican side of the aisle felt betrayed because he changed as he was on the court. So now you get people who are on appeals courts because you can vet them and make sure that they're not going to rule in a way that you don't want. And that is going to make our lives more difficult. And frankly, one of the things that happens is if you're a party and you face the prospect of being a minority because you do not have the ability to appeal to the growing segments of the electorate, and your appeal is to those who are diminishing in size, you can change your framework, change the rhetoric so you can appeal to people in a different way, change your policies enough, even within your ideological framework, so that you can reach out more broadly. Or you can suppress votes and at the same time stack the judiciary, which is making more and more policy decisions, with people in their 30s and 40s, so that long after voters have rejected you, you're going to have enormous power in the political system. And that is a really dangerous thing. And frankly, if Democrats come back into power with the House, the Senate, and the White House in 2020, and after Merrick Garland, and given what's happened on the court, their temptation is going to be to enlarge the court, to correct the injustice, to enlarge appeals courts, but they're going to be unable to do that unless they blow up the filibuster on legislation. And that has consequences, some of which we cannot foresee, that will reverberate for a long time. And it's a dilemma. What do you do when norms have been broken? And how do you unbreak them without breaking more norms and taking us into a further downward spiral? And I don't have a good answer for that doesn't have downsides to it. But that's what we face, and that's what we're going to face with the courts.
Okay, a couple more questions. With the dysfunction at the state level in various local election boards, do any state constitutions have provisions to address do-overs, and if so, do they provide a model for going forward?
There are at least a few instances where cities and states have provisions that if an election is disrupted, you can do it over, but not many. And often they operate on the fly. And that's actually what happened in New Orleans and in Louisiana after Katrina, where they had some elections coming up and they didn't have laws that regulated it. Nobody had thought about that in the same way before. So it's something that we're going to have to think about and do in another fashion. While we're talking about the states, which after all do have significant authority over elections, although the federal government retains the ultimate authority over the time, manner, and place of federal elections, there's another thing I'd like to see states do to deal with an anomaly or a problem in our political system, and that is I'd like to see states all bring in ranked choice voting for presidential elections. I don't want Jill Stein or any other independent candidate to alter the impact of an election away from what voters overall would have wanted. Now, I have no clue as to whether Jill Stein actually got funding from Russia, although there she was sitting right next to Vladimir Putin at that same dinner as Michael Flynn. But what I do know is that there was a lot of support pushed in her direction. There were a lot of Russian ads on Facebook and postings on Facebook and Twitter about how Hillary Clinton aimed at people on the left. Hillary Clinton was so awful, but there's an alternative. People who knew that you could distort the outcome of an election. And we know that Pat Buchanan and Ralph Nader did so in the 2000 election as well. I don't want to discourage independent candidates. Many of my friends have this vision of some great figure emerging and running as an independent and winning the presidency. All you have to do is step back for 5 minutes and look at the nature of our electorate, the nature of the Electoral College, and realize that the best outcome that could happen there is throwing the election into the House, that it can't work otherwise. But the only way to have people who are able to run in a different way and not have them distort the impact is if people are able to cast votes for their first choice, but then indicate their second choice and their third choice. And if we'd had that, we wouldn't have some of those bad effects. And again, that's something you could do, a state could do just by statute.
There's a lot more questions that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to. So
The answers are yes, no, and yes.
and maybe.
And maybe.
Right. So we might as well end with this one, and this is a good question. For $1 million, will Donald Trump finish his term?
So Wilbur Ross would say, $1 million? Why would I answer any question? Unknowable, but I think unlikely. I think he will be gone before the end of his term. I think that's a little more likely than not. How it happens, I don't know. I actually think one possibility is the kind of Spiro Agnew scenario. Remember, Spiro Agnew was vice president, and he had taken bribes in his governor's office and mansion as governor of Maryland. And the evidence was there. He was nailed dead to rights, and prosecutors went to him in the White House and said, basically, we're going to prosecute you to the full extent of the law, and that means a very long prison term, or you can resign and we'll do a plea bargain. And I can imagine something like that happening. It would probably take the cooperation of the New York Attorney General, where a pardon could not be applied. That's one possibility. Impeachment is another. We'll hear a lot about whether the 25th Amendment can be applied. My own view on that is it's actually a tougher battle than impeachment is. We'll hear about that. I can imagine, we also have to keep in mind this is a guy who is morbidly obese. You know that he was 6'2" through most of his adult life. And then when he ran for president, he magically became 6'3". Most of us at a certain age know that you shrink, you don't grow. But what we do know is that if you took his then listed weight at 6'2", he was obese. If you took it at 6'3", he was overweight. So he's morbidly obese. He has the worst eating habits imaginable. He gets 3 hours of sleep a night. He has tension levels through the roof, and they will probably grow. Who knows what happens under those circumstances either. But you also can't rule out the possibility, given the Senate and given the nature of our tribal media and politics. Get back to the question of Richard Nixon, another thought exercise. What if we had social media and Fox back in 1971, 72, 73? Would Richard Nixon have gone through the same impeachment process and been forced to resign? Would we have had the same kind of hearing in the Senate? I don't know, but his odds would have increased significantly. So it's entirely possible that he does finish out his term, and it's entirely possible that he runs for re-election, and that it's not a sure thing that voters reject him. Or I can tell you, if you look at the election results, state by state, cast for Congress in this past November, you could very easily leave a scenario where a candidate could lose the popular vote by 8 or 9 million and still win the presidency. So we are once again in uncharted territory. And have a nice day.